Hi, this is Coach Miller, and I'll be going over the new set of notes for World War II. And today we'll be talking about the European theater. The last two class periods we haven't really dealt with the war itself. So today we're going to about as far as like battles and things like that. Well, that will change today. So we're going to focus today on the war in Europe. There's also the war in the Pacific, which we'll get to later. But that's we're going to pick up. We're going to pick up kind of where we left off, which was where Germany had invaded Western Europe, had taken over France. They tried to take over Great Britain through the Battle of Britain, through their bombing, but were unsuccessful. In the East, they had signed that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. So that's where that's kind of where we'll pick up. Well, Hitler does not honor that non-aggression pact. So after getting frustrated with what was going on in Great Britain, he decides that he is going to invade the Soviet Union. So he breaks the non-aggression pact in June of 1941. Soviet Union is completely caught off guard. They were not prepared for this. For Germany, the problem, the reason why this is a bad idea is it makes it so that they are fighting a two-front war, meaning they're fighting the Allies, the British, the French, and the Americans, later the Americans, in the West, while the other half of the army is fighting the Soviet Union in the East. But early on, everything went very well in the Soviet Union for Germany. They were steamrolling through the first few months. Like I said, the Soviet Union was not prepared for this. Then came the Battle of Stalingrad. So if you can see, the city is named after the Soviet premier, Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin was determined not to give up this city. So he, early on, the Germans did well. They moved in and took over the city. But the Russians sent reinforcements and surrounded the city. And eventually, Russia wins the battle. And out of the about 600,000 German soldiers that went in there, only about 100,000 made it out. So this was a turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. So this was a big turning point. And from after this, it's the Soviet Union that starts gaining the advantage over Germany. The Battle of Kursk kind of continued this. This was the largest tank battle in history. There are over 1,200 tanks used during this battle. But again, this was another big turning point in the war in Eastern Europe as they started moving toward Germany. Overall, the Eastern Front was the deadliest of all the fronts. The most casualties took place. There were over 20 million dead, well over 20 million dead, more than any other theaters of World War II combined. So very, very costly to the Soviet Union. They lost more soldiers than anybody else. All right, so let's talk about U.S. getting involved. So the U.S. got involved shortly after Pearl Harbor, and so they decided not to attack France right away. They knew that that was going to be very difficult because the Germans had really fortified the beaches in France. So they thought, well, let's start south of Europe, and let's go into North Africa first. So this was known as Operation Torch, and this was a combination of U.S. and British forces. The leader of the U.S. forces was a guy by the name of General George Patton, and so he was the commander of the U.S. Third Army, and one thing he was known for was his ability to be strategic with tanks. So he was very successful at tank warfare. So tanks took a much bigger role in this war than they had in World War I. All right, the turning point of this area of the war was known as the Second Battle of El Alamein. In this battle, it was led by the British general Bernard Montgomery, and they defeated the Germans, who were led by a guy by the name of General Roman. He defeated the German general. Can't think of his name right off the top of my head. Rommel. That's it, General Rommel. But the importance of this was it protected the Suez Canal. You can see a picture of the Suez Canal on the map, and it connected the Mediterranean Sea. So essentially, you could get from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal. So after that, the Allies kept moving through Africa, and then eventually they started moving toward Europe. They crossed into Sicily, which is an island between Italy and Africa, and then from there they were able to move into Rome itself and move into Italy. And eventually they captured the leader of Italy, Mussolini. He was captured by Italian soldiers that were not, or he was eventually captured and executed, him and his family. All right, so, while they had success there, the Allies knew they would eventually also need to invade France, and it was going to be very difficult. The person put in charge of this was Dwight D. Eisenhower. So he was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. And so they decided that they were going to have a 3-stage attack of invading France. First, there was some misdirection on where they were actually going to land, but then they bombed. First, they sent paratroopers behind enemy lines. Then they bombed the beaches. And eventually, on June 6, 1944, they had the largest amphibious operation across the English Channel in history at that time. There were over 150,000 troops that landed at Normandy Beach, that is in France, so that's one of the coasts of France. And it was led by Omar Bradley, so he was the guy kind of put in charge. It was some heavy casualties were taken, especially by the Americans on this one beach. It was called Omaha Beach. But eventually the Allies pushed through, and they opened up a new Allied front in Europe. So this was a big turning point in Europe, because now the Germans have to not just focus on the Soviet Union in the east. They now have to worry about the Allies who are on land in Europe in the west. So that's the significance. So what is D-Day? D-Day was the amphibious operation across the English Channel. And why was it significant? It opened up a new Allied front. From there, the Allies kept moving toward Germany. They liberated Paris by 1944. So that was a big step. In December of 1944, so a few months later, the Germans made one last big ditch effort to try and turn this momentum to go the other way. Everything had been going, ever since D-Day, everything had been going the way of the Allies. Well, the Germans made one large counterattack, a surprise counterattack, and it's known as the Battle of the Bulge. So the United States was not really expecting it. The battle took place mostly in Belgium and Luxembourg, and overall it was the largest battle during World War II. The Germans they were taking kids that were 15, 16 years old, and because they were running out of soldiers, and putting uniforms on them and sending them into combat. And eventually, it took a while. It wasn't settled until January. It was cold. It was difficult weather conditions, but eventually the the Allies were able to win this battle. And so that was really the beginning of the end. After that, it wasn't a matter of who's going to win the war in Europe. It was just how long is it going to take. All right, so here we are. We've won the Battle of the Bulge. I said it's not a question of who's going to win. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take. So the leaders of the major countries of the Allies decide they're going to get together. So FDR, the leader of the United States, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, and Winston Churchill, who's the leader of Great Britain, they all meet at the Yalta Conference to settle issues of wartime powers. They wanted to decide, before the war is over, they want to decide, well, what do we want out of this war? When we win this war, which we're going to, what do we want the world to look like? And there were several decisions made. This was just the first of a few conferences. But one of the things that they decided that was, when this war is over, Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones. So one zone will be controlled by the Soviet Union, one zone will be controlled by the United States, one zone will be controlled by Great Britain, and another zone will be controlled by France. The idea is that they decided at this meeting is this was not going to be permanent. They were just going to establish new government and then eventually they would leave, and Germany would be able to unite and be its own country. That was the thinking at this time at the Yalta Conference. All right, so now let's go to the last couple months of the war in Europe. FDR suffers a stroke, and he dies. So this president after he had gotten elected in 1944, reelected for the 4th time, he had been the president for 13 years. His time is finally done. So he dies, and the new president is Harry S. Truman. We'll get into more about Truman when we get into the war in the Pacific. The Soviet Army, then they win the race to Berlin. So the Soviets get to Berlin first. So here is Adolf Hitler. He was in an underground bunker, and he's getting reports on how things are going. He knows the end is coming. So he gets married to his longtime girlfriend, Eva Braun, and then the next day they both commit suicide. Eva Braun took cyanide, a type of poison, and Hitler committed suicide, shot himself. He had his body burned. He didn't want his body desecrated, so his body's burned. So that's why there's some people that believe that Hitler was never killed himself, but most people feel like he did kill himself. And so shortly after Hitler kills himself, a few days later, Germany surrenders. So in May of 1945, Germany surrenders, and this is known as VE Day. VE stands for Victory in Europe. So that ends the war in Europe, and that ends my notes for the day. And I hope you find this useful, and thank you for your time.